Welcome to track one. We have a treat for you. We have Kevin Cody, and he is a hacker.
Thank you. Morning. So I get the privilege of following Avani, which if you were in here for her keynote, she was a much better speaker than I am. So thank you all for joining me. A little self-deprecation for the fun of it. We're going to be talking about application security via the browse-in built-in security features. So gear up for a bunch of GIFs and memes and hopefully some information that you can take back and use. So to get started, do we have any front-end devs in here? No front-end developers? Or you guys are sleeping? I see one hand. Fantastic. All right. Any full stack? Devs. No developers at all. All right. Well, this is going to be great. Mobile devs. Doing your mobile things. All right, guys. I don't know. How about any managers, leadership, C-level? Raise your hand, holler, throw rocks. Okay. We got some people there. Any pen testers, vuln analysts, security folk, bug hunters. All right, cool. I'm just doing that to egg you on. At the end of the day, hopefully there's a little something for everyone. I don't care if you just use apps, use the web. I threw a little something for everyone in here. So a little bit about me. I'm Kevin Cody. I'm at Kev Cody on Twitter. I usually tweet about AppSec stuff, which should surprise you. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Let's go Pens. You guys know what hockey is. That's great. Okay. I'm a principal application security consultant with Invisium. I'm a vulnerability stumble upon I'll be honest, I fall butt first into a lot of stuff, and I'm just like, hey, that looks interesting, and there might be a bug there. I'm a mainframe enthusiast. Anyone mainframers? Like 2 hands. More mainframers than front-end devs. All right. Awesome. We can talk. I'm a husband, dad, father, lockpicker, DIY via YouTube, fisherman, whatever the flavor of the moment. You might be saying, like, what's this dude from Pittsburgh doing here in Orlando? Although, I mean, look at this. This is amazing. Why wouldn't I be here? But I have some family, I have some ties here, and you may be thinking, does he really have ties here? Does he really have family here? Is he just saying this? So Pixar, it didn't happen. I used to live in Port St. John, Titusville. Any Space Coasters? Yeah, Port St. John Soccer Club back in the late 90s, and went to Space Coast Middle School before it was a high school. We were the Fighting Manatees. That's a true story. Okay. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about apps, how we can secure our apps, right? Security plus plus. When we look at the browser engines, right, we have Chromium, Blink, Firefox, Gecko, Quantum, even though I don't think they renamed their rendering engine Quantum, but Quantum. WebKit, Trident, or the Edge HTML engine, right? So let's talk about the browsers. We're going to talk about security headers and HTTP headers. You might be thinking, like, really headers, so the things that no one ever looks at, cares about. Whoa, what are we doing here? But we'll get to more on that in a moment. I'm going to go over some references and follow up with a guidance, QRG, and a blog post that says how you can utilize this in your everyday. So this is what we're trying to avoid, right? This is the often not seen moving dumpster fire, right? So that's what we're here to avoid. We'll see how that ends up in the end of the day. So this is what HTTP headers look like in 2018. And you might be thinking to yourself, that doesn't look so bad. Well, my markdown code rendering, it doesn't fit it all on the screen. So we're just going to keep scrolling here, right? It's unwieldy to say the least. It's gnarly to say probably more apropos. These are some just Amazon, AWS, Amazon headers, right? So security token, trace ID, CFID, expirations, meta versions, blah, 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 right? Headers are just insane right now. So what do some of those mean? What are we going to do? Hopefully everyone's still with me. We're really early on. Okay, so you might be saying, why is this AppSec dude going to come to us and talk to us about header security? Like, this is kind of strange. But to be honest, not everything has to be fixed at the application layer, right? Our developers, which there's like 2 in this crowd, but our developers are busy. And they don't have to fix everything. So if you're a security practitioner, your management, your vuln analyst, your pen tester, your XYZ, let's talk about how we can fix some things without having to fix them at the actual code level. And above and beyond that, some things can't be fixed at the code level. So yeah, let's talk about those as well. And even more important, right? We need to rely on some of our upstream processes to do some of the heavy lifting for us. They're more efficient, they're reproducible, they can be applied to different layers of the stack. So yeah, that's why we're here today. So we're going to dive in. It's going to be acronym soup. I didn't make up the acronyms. I'm sorry. If you have issues with the acronyms, I'm sure I can point you to an RFC mailing list somewhere, and you can take it up with them. All right. So prerequisite to this, we need to talk about same origin policy. Show of hands, who's familiar with same origin policy? You've heard of it. It sounds fuzzy. Okay, a few people. So same origin policy is basically this kind of derivative security feature of our browsers. It dates back to '95 in Netscape, so it's been around for a bit. It's obviously had some improvements. It was a pretty decent policy for what it was when it was introduced, but it's obviously grown with everything else. It's now 2018, so we're talking about, what, 23 years. So there are some exceptions for same origin policy. You might be familiar with these as well. There's cross-origin resource sharing, which we'll talk about, course. Document.domain, JSON-P, which some of you might be familiar with. There's cross-document messaging, which is interesting, and WebSockets. So just kind of keep in the back of your mind that some of these exceptions do basically allow you to get around the same origin policy, but the stateless nature of the HTTP protocol, basically it is the reason behind the same origin policy. But if we didn't have the same origin policy, we would have a really wild west security out there in our browsers. So let's talk about what an easy way to comprehend what same origin policy does. So we have BSidesorlando.org. That's our original domain. Now, I think it's actually HTTPS, so I apologize. I just went with the HTTP. But if we go to BSidesorlando.org/sessions, I know there's not Friday and Thursday here, it's Saturday, but whatever. You can see here that that's a valid same origin. So you can actually have your JavaScript or whatever you're doing calls from the origin, reach out to /sessions/Friday. That's valid. Browser will let you do that all day long. Fantastic. You can make that request to the XHR, you're good to go. Same thing with Thursday. I'm sure this surprises no one. Now, we start getting into some more interesting ones when we throw on a different port. So same high-level domain, same BSidesorlando domain, but then we have :8080, so that's the port it's running on. That web server is running on 8080. That is not a valid same origin policy. So you might be thinking, but it is the same origin, right? It's still BSidesorlando.org, but your browser will not let you request resources or make stateful changes to that domain since it's not the same origin. The same goes from our change from HTTP to HTTPS. It's a different port, right? That's pretty straightforward. The next one here is a subdomain. So we have 2018 BSidesorlando.org sessions, right? That's not valid either. You cannot request or make stateful changes from your original site to the subdomain 2018. www is just another subdomain, so unless you have some URI rewriting or whatever, that's not going to work. And then the last one here is .org port 80. So port 80 is most likely what the original site is running on. Some browsers, a little bit hit and miss, but if you explicitly specify the port, even if it's the port that the original site is running on, some browsers will actually flag that as invalid as well. So at the end of the day, just keep in mind as we're talking about some of the browser security features that the same origin policy is rooted foundation of security for what we're going to be talking about. So because of same origin policy, there was this standard that was introduced, which is the cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS. So basically what CORS allows us to do is it allows us to basically bypass in a restrictive manner the same origin policy so that we can now interact with our own sites, other sites, via JavaScript and whatnot. Again, same origin policy workaround, if you will. So there's some specifics with CORS. I'm a huge proponent of the Mozilla Documents. Their developer.mozilla.org has phenomenal dev docs, especially in the HTTP and web space. So if you're not familiar with any of the topics or specifics that I'm going to go over, I don't always shamelessly pull material from Mozilla. Some of it is paraphrased and properly self-created, but most likely there will be a document that goes in much better detail, does a much better way of introducing some of these specifics from the dev docs on mozilla.org. So definitely go out there and search it out. But basically, this talks about, if I say XHR request, that's an XML HTTP request. That's basically a way for JavaScript to do requests from within your site. Basically, CORS allows XHR, which would normally be restricted by the same origin process, to reach out to different origins and basically bypass. So if I was on sso.bsidsorlando.org, right, single sign-on, and the single sign-on wanted to post a token or some type of value to the regular www domain, you would need to use CORS if you were doing that with an XML HTTP request, or if you did it in a way that there weren't those other bypasses such as WebSockets and whatnot. So this is, I'm sure all of you can read this very well, so I'll give you a high-level overview here. This is what's called a preflight. So if you're going to use CORS, basically what happens in your browser is there's an options request that comes out. Now, if you're not familiar with options, every time you send an HTTP request, there's a method associated with an HTTP request. Options is an HTTP method. So you might be more familiar with GET or POST or PUT or what have you. Options is one of those. When the browser does an options request, basically the web server responds back with some different metadata. Used to be that before CORS and before XHR was popular, if a security practitioner found an options method was available, they'd flag it as a finding. What options? Why do you have this up? This is bad. But in today's day and age with Preflight, you need options to be enabled because the server will respond back with some headers. And again, I apologize, the graphic is small, but some of the headers might include access control allow origin, access control allow methods, etc. And basically what that does is that primes the pump for future requests using CORS. So here are some of the headers that I just mentioned. So you see your origin, your request method, your request headers. These are all going out in the request to the server, right? So if you say, hey, what's the origin that I can speak to, the server will reply back and say, here's a list of the whitelisted origins you can use CORS to communicate with. Same with method. Hey, what methods can I talk to you over? Headers. Give me a list of all your headers. The response headers are what the browser then responds with. Makes sense, right? Or the server responds with. So these will give you back your origin. These are the origins that you're allowed to talk to me over. Credentials. Do you allow the use of credentials over CORS for credentialed requests? Maximum age, etc. Okay, so I know I spit out a lot of CORS there. We'll go into a quick exercise here. So if I say, hey, I want to speak to you over CORS, and the browser responds back with, okay, you can talk to me over any origin, which means the request that is being generated from, right, like kcody.com, can talk to me because I am giving back an asterisk, right? Wildcard. Anyone can talk to me over CORS. And it's also saying allow credentials true. So what that means is if you have an HTTP cookie that's associated with that site, my request will be authenticated. That's what allow credentials true means. So kcody.com can talk to my site and can utilize the cookie jar to make credential requests. Anyone see a problem here? This is basically a huge bypass of the same origin policy, right? This is critical, sound the alarm, scary, bad news. So to see if anyone is awake, anyone wants to do some talking here, what do you think will happen if I do that? Good. So the answer there was you could get into mischief. You could do all kinds of crazy stuff, so on and so forth. Anyone else have a different thought? I know someone out there is like, he's trying to trick us. So here's the deal. You can't do that. If you say access control allow origin, wildcard, anyone can talk to me, and you say access control allow credentials true, anyone can talk to me, and they can steal my cookies. The browsers will actually say, no. This is one thing that the browsers actually do to try to rein in CORS, which basically says we're going to protect you from yourself. If this and only this configuration is applied, the browsers will basically just say, you can't do that. That's way too dangerous. And there's rationale for that because people are doing this. I see this all the time on application pen tests that I do. So that's a trick question. You can take that back, and next time you see access control allow origin, wildcard, and you see allow credentials true, and you're like, oh boy, I'm going to put together a proof of concept, and I'm going to own this. You actually can't because the browser just simply won't let you. Okay, so that was CORS. I know that was a very brief overview. Again, I'm going to dovetail this talk with a blog post that talks a little bit more about CORS, as well as how you can apply some of these headers at your perim. The next header that we're going to talk about, again, some of these will be prefaced with X, like X blank, blank, blank header or whatever header. So just disregard the X. So the next one we're going to talk about is cross-site scripting protection. People are familiar with cross-site scripting? I see some heads nodding, one hand, great. So 30,000 foot overview of cross-site scripting in under 30 seconds. Cross-site scripting is basically a way that you can embed JavaScript to do your mischief, either in a reflected, meaning the site reads the JavaScript and reflects it back to the user, or stored method, meaning that the JavaScript is stored on the site and in a database data store somewhere, and then is reflected back to all of the users, right? Basically, it's code execution at the browser level. If you're familiar with RCE, remote code execution, this is basically remote code execution in the browser, right? JavaScript is bad. If you can have JavaScript doing bad stuff in your user's browser, they can get up to some crazy mischief. And if you're not familiar with the BEEF framework, browser exploitation something framework, go out, search BEEF, XSS beef, it's insane. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff via the exploitation of JavaScript via cross-site scripting. If I take a step back, one other really concerning thing about cross-site scripting is that's JavaScript executing in the domain that your site is running, right? So we just talked about same origin policy. We just talked about CORS. Well, someone is able to execute scripts within your domain, within your site. That's a bypass of same origin policy, right? They can do whatever they want. They can send cookies elsewhere, depending. They can get into all kinds of mischief. So cross-site scripting is bad. Our browsers, some of them, have built-in protections against reflected cross-site scripting. So what this means, if you are not validating your input into your application and someone can put in a string that has JavaScript in it and it's reflected back to the screen, that's reflected cross-site scripting. It's not stored anywhere. If you do that within the URL, right, so you have an error message like kcody.com/signin, question mark, error equals, you didn't provide the right credentials, and my application is coded in a way that will take that string, put it in the browser, and echo that back to the user. That's like cross-site scripting 101, because anyone can just go in there, update that string and put in a script, and if you're not properly input validating or output sanitizing that, you now have a way of putting your content into the browser and possibly executing it as a script. Long story short, our browsers, at least i.e. Edge, Chrome, and Safari/WebKit, protect us against that. So if they see a non-obfuscated vanilla version of Crosssite scripting within the URL, one of those browsers will come back and say, hey, that's dangerous, we don't want you to do that. You might see some outliers there, right? Firefox. Firefox does not have cross-site scripting protection built into its browser. So guess who tests using Firefox when I'm trying to test this stuff, right? Long story short, it's just protection against one small variant of cross-site scripting, and it's pretty vanilla, and there are bypasses for it, so it's not a silver bullet. Firefox keeps going back to that as why they haven't implemented this feature, or Mozilla, excuse me, where the other browsers are like, but it's better than nothing, and it's not breaking anything, so we're going to include it. What's cool is, that was a really long lead up to XSS protection header. There's this header that basically you can implement that will toggle this on and off. So if you do, for whatever reason, want people to execute script in the browser or whatever, you can basically turn that protection off with a header. What else is cool is you can actually have a report that is flagged where if the user's browser blocks scripts, it usually would be an attack, right? If the user's browser blocks an attack from happening, the browser can then send a report out to you saying, hey, this user was just stopped with cross-site scripting protection in the browser. So you can now see all of a sudden, someone found cross-site scripting in my page. I should probably work on some sanitization or input validation or what have you. This is one thing that if you're a bug hunter out there and you're relying on cross-site scripting to pay the bills, this should scare you, because someone could just be scraping these reports, and as soon as they get a report that says, hey, we found cross-site scripting on this page, I'd be patching that as quickly as I could. Hopefully even deploying that as a virtual patch or something like that, so you as a bug hunter are like, yeah, I just got $1,000. I found cross-site scripting in XYZ page. I'm going to HackerOne or whatever. And I just applied a patch. And you're like, why is my proof of concept isn't working anymore? Well, you're going to have to try harder. I'm rambling a little bit. Cross-site scripting protection. It's an awesome feature built into some browsers. It's a header. If you deploy this header, you can choose whether to use that, not use it, block, don't block, report it, or not report it. The next one, content type options. So all of the content within a browser has a content type associated with it. You might be familiar with some of these MIMEs. I'm not going to go over them all. But basically, what you can do using the content type header is say, hey, this is the content type that my page is expecting or that my users will use. If you don't see that content type, don't render it, don't display it, etc. So what hackers can do is basically take an application that's only supposed to be sending and receiving text, plain text, JSON, what have you, and they can modify it to an application content type in order to get you basically to get your browser to basically pull that down, execute it, or download it, or what have you, because the browsers, at the end of the day, want to help the users do what you're trying to do. So if you download a PDF, and in the response to your requests, the content type is PDF, what do browsers do? They render a PDF, right? That's what the normal process is. If you're security conscious, you might say, don't render anything, just download it, and I'll decide if I want to open it. But that's not by default in most browsers. So what this does, again, is it basically says this is the content type that my application is sending. If you see any other content type, like an exe, executable, DMG, PDF, whatever, don't automatically render it. Don't display it. That's not the correct content type for my application. Or you can utilize no sniff, which basically says don't try to associate a content type with my application because an attacker could utilize that to get into nefarious situations. All right, the next header, HSTs. Who's familiar with HSTs? All right, cool. There's like 5%. So HSTs, HTTP Strict Transport Security. HSTS basically is kind of a super cookie that when a user reaches out to your site for the first time, this super cookie is set, which basically says, my site only talks over HTTPS, right? TLS, SSL, etc. What the rationale for that is, usually if you're not using HSTS, what happens when a user tries to browse to your site over an insecure protocol is you get a 302 redirect. And that redirect basically says, guys, I don't use HTTP, I use HTTPS. Come find me over here, right? But what's the concern with what's the concern with that redirect? Anyone? I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so the rebuttal to my recommendation of using HSTS, and it's funny because I used to work for PNC Security, so I don't know if you're doxing me or whatnot, but anyway, what the gentleman stated was that HSTS, if you are in a very small subset of older browsers or operating systems that don't support the major browsers or forks, etc., is that if you utilize HSTS, you could be basically sinkholing that very, very small percentage of user traffic that originates from one of those unsupported operating systems. So yeah, basically anything that I'm going to say here is defense in depth. That's what my job is. I'm always going to talk about it. How can we keeping the attackers at bay? All of what I say, take with a grain of salt. Do your research, do your testing. Make sure that I'm not telling you to break your site, because this is as is, no warranties, right? Don't call Invisium up and say, your guy told us to do this, and now we can't make our widgets. But anyway, back to HSTS. So any thoughts on why you might not want to do the 302 redirect when someone goes to your plain text site and force them back to HTTPS? Yeah. Exactly. So the gentleman back there said man in the middle. So what can happen is on that original redirect, that's over plain text. So if you're on an open Wi-Fi hotspot somewhere, and the way that Wi-Fi works with kind of the frames and whatnot, basically if someone can sniff that traffic, middle that traffic, they could force you to downgrade to HTTP only, and they can middle your traffic. And then what they do is they create a connection out to the site in HTTPS. This is called TLS stripping. If you're not familiar with it, definitely look it up. HSTS is a protection against TLS stripping. Basically what it says is, once the user reaches out to my site, they get a super cookie. That super cookie lasts for however long you tell it to last. And from that point on, only users who, if you reach out to that site, they're only going to connect over HTTPS. They're not going to be redirected. There's also an HSTS preload, which basically says the browser implements that right away. So there is never an original redirect that ever happens. It always goes over HTTPS. All right, the next one, which is kind of the next level over HTTP strict transport security, is HPKP. So I'm going to say all this with a big caveat, because Google has actually deprecated HPKP. And there's reason for that. But if you're not familiar with HPKP, basically it takes the HSTS that we just talked about and bumps it up another notch for those who have a extreme threat profile. And basically what it does is it says, this is the only TLS certificate that you can connect to. Even if I have a certificate from DigiNotar or whatever other owned CA that are out there, but is still trusted by your browser, even if it's a valid certificate for this domain, unless it's this specific certificate, don't trust it, right? So if you're not familiar with certificate authorities, do a little research, go out to Wikipedia or whatever your favorite research site is, and take a look at certificate authorities. Then go back to your host machine, whatever you use for your daily driver, and query how many certificates your browser trusts. At one point in time, certificate authorities your browser trusts. At one point in time, there were somewhere in the vicinity of 300 to 400 certificate authorities inherently trusted by what your browser had burnt into it. What that means is anyone who gives you a certificate for any domain from one of those certificate authorities is that your browser blindly trusts it, and you will, unless you're doing some type of out-of-band checks, you will have no idea that it's a phishing site or it's a scraping site or whatever. HPKP, again, what it does is it basically pins your browser to a specific cert or a set of certs. It looks up the hash. If the hash matches, you're good to go. And basically eschews the trust that your browser has with a certificate authority. So again, this is probably really hard to see, but basically what you see here is a public key pins header. The header says, these are the SHA-256 hashes of the certificates that I want you to trust. Even if someone has a Cody certificate for my domain, but it's by semantic or something like that, if it's not one of these certificates, don't let the user make a HTTP connection. There's also the concept of report URI, which is a concept that actually goes throughout a lot of these headers, which basically means if there's an error, if you meet some type of thing, send a report to this URL. The nice thing about that is you can see how many of your users, like the gentleman mentioned from regarding the edge cases of HSTs, you can see how many users are not able to connect to your site via the HPKP report. Okay, so I just said that Google basically deprecated this. There's a reason for that. It's because if you mess that up, you sinkhole your users' traffic. How much money are you making if you sinkhole your users' traffic? None. Zero, right? Well, I mean, you might have retail channels or something like that, but even there, you're probably going to see some ill effects. So Google basically said, hey, listen, this is getting messed up a lot. People who have strong security threat profiles want something, but this isn't the way to do it, so we're going to deprecate this. So an alternative that just came out last September, it was introduced to all the browsers and the CAs, is basically what I call HPKP Lite, or it's an alternative. What it is a Certificate Authority Authorization, CAA. It's actually a DNS record, if you're familiar with DNS. And basically what it says is, this is the certificate authority I trust to give my certificates for my domain. It's free, it's easy, it's supported by all your major DNS providers. There might be a couple little upgrades that you need to make, but and basically you can give a whitelist of trusted CAs that you trust to give out your certificates. You can have 5, you can have 10. There's probably an upper limit, but I don't know of anyone who has reached an issue with the upper limit. What happens here is even if an attacker goes out and tricks a certificate authority to generate a bad certificate for your domain, they are supposed to query this record. If their name is not in that record, they're not supposed to give you a certificate from their authority. This is part of the CA browser forum, the CAB standards. And if anyone's caught not doing this, and there's tests all the time. People are always trying to bypass this, going out. There's automated tests, there's manual tests. If you find someone who's not obeying this record, then basically Google does the old semantic on you and says, no, we're not going to trust you anymore. And if anyone's following that mayhem, good luck to a certificate authority who's not trusted by Google. Okay, the next one. Expect CT. We just talked about HSTs and HPKP, and out of that whole thing came this idea of certificate transparency. CT, I think, was introduced as part of a Google product, and then it was kind of adopted as a standard. It's not directly run by Google anymore. But basically, it's a way of doing not like blockchain, but basically Markov chain tracking of certificates. There's all these different providers who do scraping and look at the logs and et cetera. Basically, it's a way of tracking all the certificates that are provided by the different authorities that are trusted by our browsers. What certificate transparency does for us is that if you see misissuance of certificates, then there should be some type of log associated with that, and if you can really spot some different bad activities. Basically, this also came out of Google's canaries that they had within the Chrome browser, because basically Google had both sides of the equation, right? They had the browser as well as they had their CA products, and what they could do is they could basically report on any weird certificate errors that their browsers were getting for their own properties, and they kind of came up with this certificate transparency thing. Regardless, what you can do is basically add an expect CT header into your application, which says, my application utilizes certificates that support certificate transparency. What that does is if there's any fly-by-night certificate authority that somehow your browser trusts, but they don't obey certificate transparency, we can't log them. Your browser basically says, hey, something's not right here. This is some non-good certificate authority, and they're not using certificate transparency, so we can't track the issuance of certificates, et cetera, and don't connect to them. Starting in this month, Google's Chrome requires all trusted certificate authorities in Google Chrome to utilize certificate transparency. So again, Google's kind of swinging the ban hammer and forcing people down these directions since they are the majority browser. All right, I went through quick fire, lots of acronyms, a lot of stuff here. I hope that you're not Zach Galifianakis, whatever, hangover dude, with the math. I hope I didn't shoot too many acronyms at you too quickly. Pull me aside if you have any specific questions. I'm going to dovetail this, like I said, with a blog post. If you're not familiar with Scott Helm, I think it's like scotthelm.uk is a site. He's like one of the go-to authorities when it comes to headers and header security. So if you don't go to the Mozilla Dev Docs regarding any of the ones that I said, go to Scott's site. It's really good, and you can get up to speed quickly as far as the bevy of different security headers that are out there. But we're going to continue on because there's a really cool kind of roll-up security policy that takes in a lot of everything that I just said as far as these different ad hoc headers and rolls them up into what's called the content security policy. So let me just fast forward here. So this is what a content security policy looks like. I know it's really hard to see, but basically it takes a lot of the script restrictions, TLS configurations, sources, mixed content, TLS, and rolls it into one inclusive header. So almost all, if not all of the headers that I just talked about in an ad hoc nature, right? XSS header this, or HPKP this, or whatever, can basically be rolled into one succinct content security policy, so you're not trying to track all these different headers. And the cool thing about not only the headers that I spoke about before, but also content security policy, is that this can be tacked on your perimeter. So if you're using Lambda at edge functions or F5 or NetScaler load balancers or whatever, that can be tacked on outside of your normal build process, outside of your pipeline. So the nice thing about it is you're basically utilizing automation as well as utilizing your developers' time to do their thing, and you can try to secure the organization. You can also do all kinds of tooling around this and auditing and whatnot. But basically, what I would recommend is if you're trying to utilize a lot of the security headers that I just spoke to, look at CSP, look at the adoption rate of CSP, look at your user edge cases to make sure that X amount of users' browsers can't support CSP, et cetera. But maybe concentrate on creating a succinct CSP policy rather than giving out all those additional ad hoc headers. Or you can do them in tandem, and you can create some in CSP, some in ad hoc headers, and get really good defense in depth. Because CSP is a beast of its own, I could do another hour just on CSP. What I would recommend is looking at some CSP parsing assistants or auditors, right? So you have the CSP evaluator at the with Google domain. It's a Google tool. You also have No, I didn't include it. Excuse me. There's another CSP evaluator out there. Oh, it's Observatory. It is. So there's observatory.mozilla.org, and there's a bunch of different tabs within Observatory. You can do SSH Observatory, TLS Observatory, HTTP Observatory, and basically it'll give you the different rankings of all of the different resources that you use for your site. One of the ones included in the HTTP Observatory is the content security policy. Another nice thing about the content security policy parser and auditor from Mozilla is you can stand this up internally. So if you work for an organization where it's like, kind of widely frowned upon to use any type of external tooling or SaaS tooling, or you want to build this into your pipeline for your developers to grade their own stuff before hitting the publish button or something, you can stand up the Observatory stack internally and use that in your own process. There's also other auditors for outside of the Observatory. There's securityheaders.io, which I think might actually be Scott Helm's company, the guy who I had just mentioned. I could be wrong on that, so don't hold my feet to the fire. But it is a good one. I've definitely used it before. So where are we now? So we had that rolling dumpster fire to begin with. Hopefully we have like a contained dumpster fire, right? We still have unwieldy headers. We still have applications that are breaking all the time and whatnot. But our goal is to contain. Our goal is to build defense in depth, right? We don't have a mobile dumpster fire anymore. We have a stationary dumpster fire, and we can at least try to keep adding defense in depth protections in place to help lower the overall risk profile that we're exposing to our users. And like I mentioned previously, there's a lot of quick wins here, right? Turning on cross-site scripting protection and auditing, easy win, huge benefit to that. The same with the HSTs. Now it's a quick win. It's not necessarily an easy win, especially with those edge cases. But if you're already only using TLS, HTTPS, it's definitely something to look into, and definitely provides a real-world benefit to your users. Once again, it can be implemented at your edge, so you don't necessarily have to have this done at your app level or deploy at your application server, so it's a win because we can tack them on at the end. And it also reduces the overall impact of vulnerabilities for plugins, libraries, things that we aren't assessing, non-first-party code. If we're using tight sandbox controls and dovetailing that with some of these protections, we can really limit the overall impact of some of these security concerns. And it gives our developers back more time. Developers utilizing their own time to develop is better than developers trying to figure out edge case security scenarios in which we can cover with some of these HTTP header controls. All right, so I'm going to take some questions, but I just want to say thank you to the BSides Orlando staff. You're awesome. Volunteers, awesome. Attendees, vendors, family members. Can we just get a round of applause for everybody? Right. And how amazing is this venue? I just, one more quick aside, I help organize the BSides Pittsburgh, I volunteer and whatnot for BSides Pittsburgh. I attend BSides Cleveland regularly, spoken at both events, as well as spoken at BSides DFW and speaking at Knoxville here in a few weeks. This is the most amazing venue that I've been at any of those, so yeah, definitely another hand for the BSides Orlando folks. But again, I'm going to follow this up with a blog post for actual hands-on implementation, but happy to open up questions or just pull me aside. I'll be at the con the rest of the day. Yeah, any questions?
So from a compliance perspective, federal, PCI, ISO, are you seeing any of this stuff? I guess I'm surely trying to project how edge case you are in terms of, are you seeing findings that have teeth that are forcing companies to implement this, or you think we're 1, 2, 3 years out from where you are in terms of your knowledge?
So I'll answer that with a funny story. So my consultancy is a SOC 2 compliant consulting company. We were going through that audit process last year, and we were actually educating our auditor on HSTs. So I still think some of these are a little bit edge case. However, I think adoption is going to be there. obviously, as things become standard at the browser level and are pushed more from your big players, I do see that, I could see that some of these things could be funneled down and actually picked up in your NIST standards, your SOC compliances, et cetera. But at the end of the day, right now, almost all, if not everything that I mentioned regarding headers or CSP are defense in depth. I haven't seen any specific SOC or compliance questions related to that, outside of maybe internal compliance, right?
Right. Understood.
Any other question?
No, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. One brave question. Any more? A few more minutes? Yes. You can just, if you want, I can just repeat it. Up to you.
Okay. With TLS 1.0 and 1.1 going away,
Yep.
and you know, our grandparents or in-laws still using XP machines at home, and that iPhone 2, what's going to be the net effect?
Yeah, so the question here was, we're seeing the deprecation and the easing out of the vulnerable, deprecated TLS 1.0, 1.1. We've just saw the introduction of TLS 1.3, which means who knows how long 1.2 is going to be supported. But it's not official yet. It's still in research. But anyway, the question here is, what impact do we see as far as our users who are utilizing XP machines or machines that don't support 1.2 or beyond? I think that's a real, obviously a real question. I think our analytics around our sites and tooling can give us some valuable insight into our user agents and understand what percentage of edge cases of users are running into those limitations. I personally believe with the movement to iOS, Android as a primary computing platform, I think all versions of Android from 2 or 3 on support, if not even before, support 1.2 and above, well, not above, but 1.2, as well as the iOS, anything supported iOS-wise. So I think that will limit the overall impact of users who are utilizing outdated or unsupported machines that use browsers that don't have that. But I think it's a real question. And obviously, take that back to 2011, 2013, I would have had a very different answer for you. But I think it's minimal as far as impact. Follow up? I think it's probably the last one.
Real quick, is anybody aggregating 1.3 errors besides some individuals in the room?
So the question, if anyone wants to raise their hand or seek this gentleman out independently, is, has anyone done any type of aggregation of TLS 1.3 adoption and errors? Specifically, he mentioned error rate. I know I haven't really gotten into 1.3 too much until it solidifies.
Is anybody important doing it, or has it hit?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure, as the spec solidifies, I'm sure that the big players of the game will absolutely do aggregation of 1.3 adoption and effects on that. The nice thing is, and I think I need to go, the nice thing is that 1.2 doesn't have any major security vulns that we can see, so hopefully we can keep them in tandem. Thank you all. Really appreciate it.